Hello everybody, Trevor here. I am just inserting this little audio clip after I recorded the entire episode because I wanted to let you know that I'm going to embed a map into this podcast because there's a lot of geography in it and I want you all to know what's going on. So if you just look at your screens right now, you will see where it shows up. Alright, back to the real show. The History of Poland Podcast, episode 39. Get it together, Piasts. Hello and welcome back. Last time we left off with Poland in a state of limbo. Sure, there were momentous events happening, the Teutonic Order being invited to invade Prussia being one of them, but with only a small series of seemingly unimportant events happening in Poland proper. If anyone was a ruler, it was Conrad, but even he was just ruling by force of power and not by claiming the throne himself. Meanwhile, there are rebellions aplenty and schemes galore, as every Piast prince, duke, or cousin tries throwing their hat into the ring to try to become the Grand Duke. All of this is quite a confusing time in Polish history. One person claims land that another disputes, nothing changes because of it, and then we repeat. Multiply that sequence times 1,000 and you have a rough idea of what's going on. So I was pondering to myself, how can I best explain this time period in Poland? I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds of every single siege of every single castle, but I also don't want to breeze through these events as if thousands of people didn't die to make these events happen. With that tug of war happening in my mind, I've decided to try to cover the period of time in between the most consequential rulers fairly, but without making everybody listening very bored and lost, to the point that nobody knows what's going on anymore. We'll start where we picked up last episode in the year 1232. We're going to cover the time going up to the beginning of a very momentous event about a decade in the future. It's a lot of material to cover, but you'll thank me in the end that I didn't drag this out. In the year 1232, we start with Władysław Odenik, the Duke of Wielkopolska. He's a fair-minded guy who has a pretty sweet life, so he decides he's going to give thanks to God for that. To do this, he grants some privileges to the city of Gniezno and Poznan, both of which have cathedrals in them. Because of this, he decides to exempt the churches, cities, and inhabitants of those areas from taxes, compulsory service, or any other tribute. Not just what's owed to him, but what's owed to anybody. This annoys pretty much everyone who would have been the recipient of those taxes, barons, knights, etc. In fact, Jan Długosz tells us that, quote, the lavishness of Władysław's gifts to the church exasperates the barons and knights of Wielkopolska to such an extent that they secretly plot his death. Indeed, when a planned ambush fails, they rebel openly. End quote. That rebellion really kicks into high gear when the rebels approach Henry the Bearded. We've talked about Henry in the past, so he needs no introduction. The only thing I'll note is that he apparently really disliked Władysław on a personal level, so the offer of rebellion was music to his ears. Długosz tells us that Henry, quote, invades Wielkopolska with a considerable army. Władysław, well aware that his knights have turned against him and afraid that Henry's army is the stronger, as well as that his own knights may well betray or desert him, does not come out into the open. End quote. Władysław burns some of his castles to the ground as he retreats northwards towards Pomerania. In response, he loses the loyalty of all of the leading figures in his territory who switch sides to Henry. Henry takes control of 99% of the area, fortifies his new castles, and garrisons the cities with troops loyal to him personally. So that's the state of things in Wielkopolska. Meanwhile, over in Kraków, the last we heard was that Conrad was in charge, even though his nephew, Bolesław the Bashful, also known as Bolesław the Chaste, should have been. This was all fine and good while Bolesław was a wee child, but now he's grown up. He's like 10. The issue, though, is that Conrad really likes being in charge, and doesn't want this random 10-year-old to be in charge. Długosz tells us of this inevitable clash, saying, quote, encouraged and prompted by his mother and the Bishop of Kraków, Bolesław decides that he wants to be free of his guardian, his uncle Conrad, and independent. Conrad, appalled at the prospect of the loss of income this will involve, invites Princess Grzymislava and his nephew to a friendly discussion of the duchy's affairs, and when they come, promptly imprisons them, accusing them of prematurely attempting to regain ducal authority. He holds them in the castle in Sieciechów on the Vistula, where they are carefully guarded. He confiscates the contents of his nephew's treasury and makes stubborn efforts to gain control of the whole duchy. He even considers killing his nephew, but is dissuaded by the Duke of Gniezno and Marek the voivode of Kraków. He then sends his 2 prisoners to the monastery at Siecieczów, where they are kept under strict surveillance until he can devise ways of resolving his dispute with them. End quote. So that's fun. Your uncle invites you over for a friendly chat about the family business, imprisons you and your mom, and then mulls over whether or not to kill you. Having squashed the slightest hint of rebellion from his family, Conrad decides to use this opportunity to invade Prussia. He assembles an army and advances into Prussian territory. The army is fairly successful, but that's likely because there wasn't a centralized army fighting back against them, so it's not a win, but it's not a loss. While he's off fighting in Prussia, events are happening back at home. Długosz tells us that, quote, while Conrad is thus engaged, Bolesław the Bashful and his mother escape from Siecieczów, thanks to the abbot, who bribes the guards, so that, one night when the latter are carousing, they, quote-unquote, forget to set the usual sentries, thus allowing Bolesław and his mother to walk out of the monastery at dead of night to carriages awaiting them and drive off. 2 castles, Sandomierz and Zawiszos, come over to them, but they do not dare remain in their own lands, lest they end up in prison again, and so go to their relative, Henry the Bearded, by whom they are well received and accommodated. When Bolesław asks for help in recovering his duchy, Henry promises to give it, but he wants to know what recompense he can expect for his trouble and the outlay it will entail. Bolesław assures him that he will have all his expenses refunded and either be paid for his trouble or be given part of the duchies. End quote. So this sounds like a decent plan, and it looks like Henry is going to go for it. But what really pushes him over the edge is that while he's negotiating, he receives word that Conrad's son has been ransacking Kraków, and that Kraków has been fighting back, and that there's a brewing civil war happening there. Infuriated that a ruler is attacking subjects that are loyal to his own family, Henry heads off to Kraków. When he gets there, Długosz tells us that, quote, everyone is so disgusted with Conrad's rule that they rush to receive and acknowledge their rightful duke. Henry, having taken possession of Kraków, Sandomierz, and Lublin, proves to be a kindly champion and guardian of Bolesław. He assumes the authority and title of Duke, both of Wielkopolska and Kraków and Sandomierz. End quote. I feel like I need to state a rule here. Make sure you're popular with your subjects. Otherwise, when you fall asleep, your cousin will show up and get them to overthrow you. This seems pretty obvious, but it also seems that pretty much nobody did this. Oh well, what can I do? It was 800 years ago, after all. But moving on, Conrad gets wind of the escape and war happening around Kraków and decides to invade. Surprise! The invasion doesn't go well on 2 fronts. First, Conrad is very unpopular, and even his bribery isn't winning any friends. Second, Conrad makes the decision to convert churches into fortified installations in which he'll garrison troops. This makes him even more unpopular, as this was evidently the first time this was done on a large scale in Poland. The war doesn't go well for Conrad, who is eventually forced to retreat after continually losing to Henry the Bearded's forces. Following this, Henry and Bolesław realize they need to work out who's in charge. After all, Bolesław is all of 11 years old now, and he wants to be in charge. The advisors to both Henry and Bolesław meet to hash out a deal. What they come up with is that Bolesław will be seen as an adult and ruling in his own right, and that Henry will agree to that. Then, as Bolesław is ruling in his own right, Bolesław will then decide, on his own I'm sure, that he needs a mentor to guide him, and will wisely pick Henry the Bearded. It's amazing how that all worked out. Everyone is happy, everybody except Conrad, who is very unhappy because he would like to be the chosen mentor. But that's not how the game is played, buddy. Długosz tells us that, quote, from now on, Henry regards himself as monarch of all Poland, and indeed is considered the most important of its dukes. But, out of consideration for Bolesław, he does not use the title Duke of Kraków and Sandomierz, but merely calls himself Duke of Wielkopolska and Silesia. Bolesław, eager to repay the cost of wresting his duchy from Conrad's clutches, assigns to Henry important tolls and other revenues in both Kraków and Sandomierz, as well as some salt revenues and customs dues. End quote. Sounds like a lovely arrangement. After a bit of time, the arrangement is even sealed by a marriage ceremony between the son of Conrad and the daughter of Henry. Wonderful times are ahead. Or at least they would have been if Henry hadn't gotten sick. Długosz tells us of this fatal sickness and also shines some light on Henry's character, telling us, quote, Henry suddenly falls ill while on a visit to one of the farthest flung parts of the duchies, near the Bohemian frontier. His wife, the Blessed Jadwiga, is informed by express messenger. but despite repeated requests that she go to her husband, she refuses to do so, lest the sight of him ill should kindle in her a spark of sympathy for him after the 30 years of their living celibate lives apart and meeting only when a meeting was essential. The Duke's state deteriorates, and after receiving the last sacraments, he dies on March 19, 1238. He acquired the nickname the Bearded when, at the request of his wife, he embarked on a life of celibacy and, following the example of a conversus, let his beard grow, discarded his splendid robes of gold and purple, and only wore modest woolen garments. His body is brought to Trebnitsa for burial, and there all the nuns and a throng of peasants and the gentry of both sexes gather to pay their respects. Indeed, Jadwiga is the only woman there to refuse him the last honors and whose eyes remain dry." End quote. I promised myself I wouldn't get into it, but I would love to know what went on between Jadwiga and Henry. I mean, that is a cold shoulder right there. Who wronged who? What causes this situation? I don't know, but wow, would I love to know this story. With Henry dead, the balance of power shifts slightly. Henry's son, also named Henry, is now Duke. Conrad is still around, wanting power, and Boleslav is still a relatively young adolescent who is nominally the Duke of Krakow. Długosz tells us that Conrad wasn't just content to sit around, but instead, quote, "Conrad of Mazovia once again starts playing an active part in affairs. He hates Boleslav the Bashful for having, as he sees it, slighted him when he chose as his mentor Henry, with whose help Boleslav won several minor engagements with Conrad. So, shortly after Henry's death, Conrad renounces the pact that he and Władysław made, and, at first covertly, then openly, makes forays into parts of Krakow, Sandomierz, and Lublin." End quote. Boleslav sees what Conrad is up to and decides to take action. He sends word to the King of Hungary that he would like to marry his daughter, Kinga. Kinga is an interesting girl, aged 15 at the time, who was very religious. They marry. Interestingly enough, they never consummate the marriage, which is why Boleslav is known to history as Boleslav the Chaste. Aside from just being a marriage, which is important in and of itself, it was also important enough that Conrad decided to stop invading Boleslav's territories. But not all marriages make Conrad happy. No, his son Casimir apparently married somebody about the same time, and is apparently so in love with her that he just lazily sits around all day. Conrad believes that this isn't just laziness, though, and is instead the manipulation of one of Casimir's tutors, the Chancellor of Mazovia. Conrad concocted a scheme to deal with this Chancellor, and, well, I'll let Długosz tell you all about it. He says, quote, "Conrad summons the Chancellor home, pretending that he wishes to consult him about his son's behavior. When the Chancellor arrives, Conrad has him thrown into a noisome prison, and after a few days made to ride the wooden horse, after which torture he has him publicly hanged like a common thief. The Chancellor's body is taken down by some Dominican friars who try to take it back to the city for burial, but are stopped by Duchess Agatha, who has long thirsted for the Chancellor's blood, and now, like a second Jezebel, has the body taken from them, put on a cart drawn by 2 oxen, and taken to the river, near the church of St. Benedict, and there hanged on a gallows specially erected. The Dominican prior sends some of his brethren to take the body down from this second gallows and has it buried in the cathedral. The whole country is appalled by the news of Duke Conrad's treatment of his chancellor. Peter, the Bishop of Płock, is afraid to take any action, but the Archbishop of Gniezno places an interdict on all churches in his diocese and sends out an official notice to this effect. The interdict first angers Conrad, then frightens him, and he sends to the Archbishop demanding a meeting. One is arranged, which Conrad attends in person with his counselors. Conrad now exhibits signs of repentance and undertakes to expiate his crime by doing whatever penance is imposed on him. Having thus humbled himself, it is decided that as expiation he must grant the cathedral and its archbishop the right to possess in perpetuity the village of Lovich and its surrounding woods and forests in which the duke is accustomed to hunt, the bishop paying 1 gold mark annually in recognition of the duke's overlordship. The Archbishop of Gniezno is to have in perpetuity the prebend of a canonry with all its rights in Płock Cathedral. The cathedrals of Włocławek and Płock are to be granted certain liberties and gifts in perpetuity. Conrad agrees to all this both verbally and in writing, and with this guarantee is relieved of the accusation of murder, the interdict is raised, and services are resumed. However, the Duke is told that complete absolution can only be obtained from the Pope, but when the application is made, the Pope rescinds the absolution and instructs Thomas, Bishop of Wrocław, and Gerard, scholar of Krakow, to check that Conrad has made the requisite amends before he can be granted the benefit of absolution. When these confirm that the requisite amends have been made and that Conrad's two sons consent to the transfer to the cathedrals of Gniezno, Włocławek, and Płock of the rights, privileges, and gifts detailed in the original document, the charge of murder is withdrawn." End quote. So that's a pretty terrible situation, and I'm sure that it consumed life in Poland at the time because an interdict was no laughing matter. But life in Poland is about to get a lot worse, because after all these years of constant infighting, civil war, rebellion, and if I'm being honest, general idiocy, the Poles look up and see a cloud on the horizon. The Mongols have arrived. And that's where we'll stop for now. If you enjoy the show, your support on Patreon is always deeply appreciated. For a couple of bucks, you get access to exclusive perks, which come out on an ongoing basis. That includes an upcoming series on the Mongol invasion of Europe that will go into more detail than I'll cover on this podcast. You can donate by going to patreon.com/historyofpolandpodcast. Thanks to everyone who already supports the show. Until next time, thanks for listening.